South Carolina, May 1715. Colonial refugees flood into Charlestown for protection. Indian raids in the country have driven them from their homes. Just a few miles outside the city, attacks continue as bands of Indians numbering in the hundreds burn plantations, steal livestock, and murder anyone naive enough to stay outside the city. Minister Francis LaJow writes of the experience, "The Indians that surround us on every side but the sea revolted from us by unanimous consent. Conditions within Charlestown are miserable. The cries and groans of the women and the children are heard unceasingly. The summertime heat of the American South is combined with overcrowding, famine, and disease. A lack of soldiers and supplies make destitute any hopes of fighting back or escape." South Carolina Governor Charles Craven says that he and his fellow colonists are almost naked and defenseless, and know not how soon some of us may be in the hands of those monsters of mankind, the Indians. Some, like Reverend Thomas Hassell, blame themselves for their current condition. He quotes Leviticus, "When ye are gathered together within your cities, I will send the pestilence among you, and ye shall be delivered into the hand of the enemy." Everyone fears that the colony is on the brink of collapse. Welcome to Dates and Dead Guys. I research historical topics I find interesting and explain them in a way I would to my friends. If that is your kind of thing, please like the video and subscribe, or leave a comment. It's fun, and I hear it helps the channel grow. But let's get into the story. The opening places us in Charlestown, South Carolina, in May of 1715. The English colony was closer than any other to being destroyed by its enemies during the early months of the Yamasee War. Not shockingly, the war didn't have to happen. For decades, the colony actually had very agreeable relationships with most of the local tribes, minus the Indian slave trade. That's going to cause some disagreements. Despite that particular choice, the colony was pretty invested in keeping good relationships. The friendly Native American tribes on the perimeter formed a buffer zone between them and who the colony thought was their real enemy, namely the Spanish, the French, and the Indians being stolen as slaves to the interior. Originally intended to be a plantation colony, the early years in South Carolina were grim. Settled in 1670, it would take a few decades for the colony to establish rice and indigo as viable cash crops. In the meantime, their largest exports were cattle, hogs, deerskins, and Indian slaves. I don't mean to scoot by the Indian slave topic. It's going to play a huge role in our story, but deerskins are as well, and I have a fun fact. Deerskins, or buckskins, are exported by thousands in the colony and are going to be used as literal currency. If I needed something in trade, I might give you a buckskin for it, but a buckskin is a bit of a mouthful, so in time people began to refer to them as bucks. I'll give you a knife for $5, or it's $10 for that coat. That's where we get the term we now use to mean a dollar. That was neat, but back to Indian slavery. The 8 aristocrats that controlled the colony, the Lords Proprietors, actually forbid the Indian slave trade, understanding that even if it was profitable, it was bound to cause conflict. But enforcement was lax, because of the ocean and the fact that people are traveling by sail, plus there was money to be made. Some of the more wealthy colonists, called the Goose Creek Men, won't miss their opportunity, and they enlist tribes like the Yamasee to raid other tribes, capture their people, and trade them to the colony in exchange for valuable European goods like guns, powder, and metal tools. The Yamasee themselves are a bit of an aberration. We picture tribes that we imagine being around for centuries. Writer Scott Weidensaul called them a composite people thrown together by circumstance. They were a mishmash of several displaced groups. They were first noted by the Spanish in St. Augustine in 1663, but gradually grew in number and began to settle in the Port Royal area in South Carolina. Into the early 1700s, there were 10 Yamasee towns in the area with roughly 1,300 inhabitants. During this time, South Carolina set up trading outposts, with traders inhabiting Native American towns of the Yamasee, Creek, Chickasaw, Cherokee, and Catawba, just to name a few. For a while, trade relationships within South Carolina were more or less peaceful. Tribes like the Yamasee even assisted South Carolina in some earlier wars. Thomas Narn, an Indian agent and a good name to remember because of irony, even said of Native American relations with the colony in 1710, quote, "All of the Indians within 700 miles of Charlestown have been made English subjects," end quote. And that seems to be true. That is, until debt starts to rack up. Predatory colonial traders would let tribes like the Yamasee buy English goods on credit, which they did. If buckskins are a massive trade good and hunting is seasonal, people would expect to be paid later. But a decade of overhunting led to a fall in the deer population, and buckskins would become harder to come by. By 1711, the Yamasee owed a collective debt of over 100,000 deer skins to the traders, and that's more than the colony generally exported in a year. In order to help pay off the debt, the colony already pushed an already active Indian slave trade into hyperdrive. Minister Francis LaJoie wrote about it in his journal. Quote, "It is reported that some of our inhabitants excite them Indians to make war amongst themselves, to get slaves which they give for our European goods." End quote. An Indian slave is worth far more than a deerskin, and many Yamasee saw it as a far easier way to pay off their debt. Between 1617 and 1715, an estimated 24,000 to 51,000 Native Americans were exported from the colony. That is more than African slaves were exported to the colony during this time. When the debts were not paid off, the Carolina traders started to get aggressive. Some threatened to enslave the families of the debtors, and this was across several tribes, not just the Yamasee. And they were getting frustrated with these colonists who they outnumber. We know that they outnumber them because in early 1715, the colony conducted a census of 141 Native American towns. They counted 28,000 people. South Carolina at the time had around 7,000 colonists, although they also had an additional 4,000 slaves. This census, to a lot of Native American groups, looked like record keeping for the intention of enslaving them when the time came. Governor Charles Craven sends a small group to meet the Yamasee at Pocatalago, one of the Yamasee towns near Port Royal. The party included at least 6 people, but maybe a few more. Among them are 2 guys. One we know, Indian agent Thomas Narn, and the other, John Wright, is Narn's rival. They are both fighting over the same job. In recent days, the colony had gotten word from traders the Lower Creek and other Indian nations were planning to attack the colony. They were there to resolve issues with the Yamasee and to ensure their support against the Lower Creek. This encounter goes horribly wrong. Historian William L. Ramsey suggests the single largest reason was schizophrenic policy. Narn and Wright hold 2 separate meetings, which is odd. Politically, having a united front makes sense. In Narn's meeting, he promises peace and diplomacy. He assures the Yamasee that they are allies to the colony. He says Governor Craven is personally coming to meet with them to work on their debt, that the colony has no interest in pushing them off their land, and that these aggressive traders have no right to enslave them. He kills it. The Yamasee think that meeting went great, and then Narn goes to bed. Even though he probably should have gone to bed too, John Wright then meets with the Yamasee. Wright has an easy layup. The Yamasee feel great after the Narn meeting. The only way to mess this up is if he does something really stupid, like threatens to kill them or questions their pride. But that is exactly what he does. Schizophrenic policy. Then, after that, Wright just goes to bed, like the town he's in isn't just filled with tomahawks. But the Yamasee stay up, debating into the night, unsure of the colony's true intentions. They come to the only conclusion they can. And then they begin to put on their war paint. Quote, "At dawn, their terrible war whoop was heard, and a great multitude was seen whose faces and several other parts of their bodies were painted with red and black streaks, resembling devils come out of hell. It is usually in this guise that they appear in war. The red indicates war, and the black represents the death without mercy which their enemies must expect. They threw themselves first upon the agents and on Mr. Wright, seized their houses and effects, fired on everybody without distinction, and put to death with torture in the most cruel manner in the world." End quote. That cheery excerpt is from a colonial merchant named Charles Rodd, in a letter he wrote to his employer in London. It's one of the best primary sources on the topic. It details the initial attack, the Pocatalago massacre, as well as the days to come. He goes on to explain that one man present at the attack, a Captain Burrows, escaped by swimming across a river but was shot twice. Quote, "One of which pierced his neck and came out his mouth, and the other pierced his back and lodged in his chest, without touching a vital spot." End quote. As the embassy worked to round up colonists near the town of Pocatalago, Burrows, now a human snorkel, made his way to the nearby Port Royal to warn the town of attack. On word of Burrows, they start to evacuate. Some of the town didn't believe him, but most felt the bullet holes in his neck and back were convincing, as well as the gunshots and screams in the distance. The colonists couldn't scatter by roads. They all went through Indian territory, so most looked to water. Several hundred went aboard a smuggler's ship that had been kept in port and prepared to make defense there. Rodd writes that aboard the ship, quote, "They received the wretched inhabitants to the number of about 400, and as night drew on, scarcely had these unfortunates got on board when the Indians entered the plantations and, finding nobody in the houses, came down to the water's edge and fired heavily on the ship all the night, but killed no one. They continually repeated their diabolical war whoop as they fired. Next day, they killed the horses and cattle with gunshots and sacked and plundered everything they met with, dancing in a grotesque fashion and uttering loud cries of joy which they fired and burnt the houses. Such a spectacle might have given pleasure, had not the results been so disastrous." End quote. The next day, when the tide comes in, the colonists aboard are able to sail the ship out of port and head north to Charlestown. Other settlers make their way by canoe, going through the sea islands and others taking their chances in the open ocean. Still, over 100 colonists between the plantations outside of Pocatalago and Port Royal were killed or captured. One unnamed man escaped the Yamasee. He hid in a marsh and walked around naked because it thought it made him look more like an Indian. It's stupid, but it worked. He witnessed the fate of many colonists, including our agreeable Indian agent, Thomas Narn. Rod reports, quote, "The criminals loaded Mr. Narn with a great number of pieces of wood, to which they set fire, and burnt him in this manner so that he suffered a horrible torture during several days before he was allowed to die." End quote. The letter suggests this happened to many people who were captured by the Yamasee. Rumors of ritual torture, like what happened to Narn and his companions, spread terror to the colonists, and they quickly moved to Charlestown as refugees. Prior to the Pocatalago massacre, on Good Friday, Governor Craven was already on his way to Pocatalago from Charlestown with a militia of about 250 men. The Yamasee knew this because Narn had told them before he was tortured to death. Yamasee scouts find the party pretty early on, but it's not until a few days later, on April 19th, that they get into a battle. The colonial militia is outnumbered, but in an open, structured fight, they have an advantage. The colonists take 20 casualties, but the Yamasee retreat after several of their leaders are killed. One of the Yamasee killed in the fight had a letter in his pocket intended for Governor Craven. It was written by a white captive, but dictated by a Yamasee leader, the Huspa King. It was an explanation for why the Yamasee had attacked the colonists, and it sets an ominous tone for the objectives of the assault. Quote, "Mr. Wright said that the white men would come and fetch the Yamasees in one night, and that they would hang 4 of the head men and take all the rest of them for slaves, and that he would send them all off the country, for he said that the men of the Yamasees were like women. What he said vexed the great warriors, and this made them begin the war. And the Indians have killed 40 or 50 white persons, and the Indians are all coming to take all the country. They are 300. That they are going to watch to take the fort at Captain Woodward's, and that at Welltown. For in short, all of the Indians upon the main are coming, and they say that the white people will not be a handful for them." End quote. Your insults did this. We are coming for everything, and it will be easy. The Yamasee intend to destroy the colony. Maybe not great strategy, telling them how many warriors they have or where you intend to strike, but it's nerve-wracking regardless. With 300 warriors, the Yamasee may be able to do serious damage to the colony, but it's not just them. The letter says all the Indians upon the main are coming. It's not quite Little Bighorn, but I'm sure it felt that way for the colonists. The meeting with the Yamasee prior to the Pocatalago massacre took place because of rumors that other tribes, particularly the Lower Creek, were planning to attack the colony. We addressed this before. Plenty of tribes had issues with the colonists. Upon hearing of the Yamasee attack, each tribe had to weigh their own circumstances, but many felt that they had reason to take up arms. They were pestered by little things like massive debt, loss of hunting land, fear of being enslaved, and abusive traders. Over the course of the next few weeks, the backcountry of South Carolina turned to violence. At the time, there were around 100 traders in the Indian villages of South Carolina. 90 were killed, and the ones that survived only narrowly escaped. Among the participants were the Lower Creek, Cherokee, Catawba, and Chickasaw. One article, published by the University of South Carolina, suggested the killing of traders was a stern message. The message being that English promises for reform were no longer acceptable. Alliances were no longer appropriate or possible. By killing the traitors, the Indians were announcing to the English the need to negotiate a new relationship. By early May, word of the murders reached Charlestown. Those south of Charlestown and in the backcountry have already fled to the city for safety. There, the refugees begin to make preparations for the coming attacks, as groups like the Catawba declare war on the colony. But by May 14th, raids to plantations begin, and they will continue for the next 2 months. The attacks begin to the north of Charlestown in the Goose Creek area. Hundreds of Indians are on a war party, mostly Catawba, and on May 16th they encountered a colonial militia with roughly 100 men. The war party ambushes them, killing a quarter of them, and the rest are forced to retreat back to Charlestown. colonists evacuate the Goose Creek area. Minister Francis LaJoie believed hope was lost for South Carolina. He wrote in his journal, quote, "If this torrent of Indians continue to fall upon us, there is no resisting," end quote. He stated the colony may be forsaken. The North is left completely unprotected for weeks. Even fortified plantations were not safe. Shanking's Fort, where 30 men were held up, was attacked on July 5th. Larry E. Ivers tells the story in his book, This Torrent of Indians, a title that he clearly stole from LaJoie's journal. He said the fort's commander, Redwood, was asked by the Indians to discuss peace. Ivers writes, quote, "Redwood relented and invited a delegation of unarmed Indians inside the stockade walls for a conference. As a show of trustworthiness, he ordered his men to lay down their weapons. The war captains accepted the invitation, and their representatives entered the fort. At some point during the subsequent negotiations, the warriors suddenly drew knives and hatchets that they had concealed about their persons and attacked the disarmed South Carolinians." End quote. The fort's security was apparently run by this guy, because he didn't catch shit. About 20 colonists were killed and another 10 were taken prisoner. The rage in the countryside continued, with many plantations burned and livestock slaughtered. The Indians actually get so comfortable being uncontested that the war party sends for their families, likely to help them carry the goods that they are finding. They also stop using scouts and checking for colonial militias, which was dumb. On June 13th, Captain Chicken, a hilarious name for a soldier, catches the war party off guard with a militia of about 120 men. They are able to scatter the war party, killing about 40 of them. This is the first major break the colony gets. The Catawba, having lost 40 warriors, withdrew from the war, but the damage was already done. The settlers in Goose Creek were left without any supplies, their homes were destroyed, and they had nowhere else safe to go but Charlestown, as other tribes were mobilizing to the west. By June and July, the entire colonial population were either held up in forts or, for the majority, were squeezed up against the coast in Charlestown. Over the course of May, serious preparations were being made. Martial law was declared and the colonial government seized weapons, provisions, medicines, and ships, but these are only the items that they have. Without outside assistance, they didn't have the men or supplies to hold off a substantial assault. Food was another problem. Outside the city, there were crops and livestock, but each raid burned and killed what they found. Colonists couldn't get to their supplies because of the chance of being murdered, so they were stuck and they were vulnerable. Word was sent to northern colonies and to the Lords Proprietors for assistance, but there was no telling at what time, if any, aid would be coming. Virginia offered to send men, but only if South Carolina sent slave women to Virginia in their place. That is a thing that really happened. The Virginia governor even commented later that South Carolina must not have been very serious because no slaves ever arrived. North Carolina did respond. By early July, they were sending 110 men south, 60 of them Indians, to help in the fight. Governor Craven took a militia force north to meet them, and in his absence, more raids took place to the west of the colony. War parties, including members of various tribes, rumored to be 500 to 700 strong, crossed the Edisto River by the Pompon Bridge. They raided Willtown, just as the letter of the Yamasee Huspa King said they would. But the natives went around the fort in Willtown. People were firing on them from the inside. It's much easier to plunder and burn plantations in the countryside unopposed. But now the war party was just 12 miles from Charlestown, with essentially the entire colony pushed to the edge of the continent. The people lacked provisions. The only significant fighting force outside of a fort is already away to the north. The people are hungry, many sick, and the soldiers left were outnumbered. One more push, and the colony may be destroyed. As the people of Charlestown wait, the words of the Yamasee Huspa King ring in their minds. The Indians are all coming to take all of the country. But the war party never enters the city. Every advantage was on the side of the natives. They had the colony exactly where they needed them. Indian warriors outnumbered colonial fighters 5 to 1. Even if they didn't kill them, they could have captured them, held them hostage, or seized the city and forced them out by water. There are larger implications too. Several political leaders, including Virginia Governor Alexander Spotswood, were concerned of what might happen to the other colonies should South Carolina fall. Quote, "A triumph over the very province, which has been ye most famous for keeping ye Indians under subjugation, and the booty taken from it might invite all the heathen upon this continent to unite their forces and try to overrun the rest of our colonies." End quote. Tribes teaming up against the English was not a model the colonies wanted the Indians to learn was effective, but it doesn't happen. Governor Craven got word of how close the raids were to the city, and he abandoned his trek north to return and fight. It's actually kind of funny. When he got word of the raids, his force had just spent all day crossing a river, and he immediately had to spend the rest of the day crossing back. The raiding party, much larger than his, retreated before he ever gets there. They moved back to the west, content with the loot and scalps they had gotten for their trouble and the destruction that they had caused. They literally burned the Pon Bridge on their way out just to make sure that Craven's force can't follow them. When they did that, major hostilities in the war were over for good. A lot of times we make the mistake of thinking Native Americans are one thing, and they are not. There are massive cultural differences between groups, and common goals are oftentimes hard to come by. Tribal populations are small enough in the 1700s that losing 20, 30, or 40 people in a fight is devastating to the security of your people, and for that reason, it was rare that these groups would take fights that were not very much in their favor. That's what happened to the Catawba. One serious loss knocked them out of the conflict, and it was no longer worth it for them. For that reason, open field combat was a non-option. Raids were the way. The war is going to go on for another 3 years, but after the Western raids in July, the colony will never again be in danger of destruction. Many tribes that seemed dedicated to eradicating the colony soon found themselves conflicted. There were a number of reasons. The biggest two, as far as I can tell, were old rivalries and trade. The Cherokee, who had assisted the Catawba in the northern raids, for example, have rivals like the Creek. Teaming up against the Europeans was fun for a little while, but those Europeans have a lot of important trade goods. You can't be too distracted for too long because eventually you're going to want to go back to fighting the Creek. Native American groups also found themselves in supply trouble, and some of the goods they had grown dependent on, namely guns and powder, were more important than their differences with the colony, and they switched sides. It also helped the colony was being more agreeable now that they needed allies. The Catawba, for example, who had killed a lot of colonists north of Charlestown, saw the Yamasee pushed out. That was an opportunity to become the colony's largest trading partner, and they took it. Additionally, shipments of guns from Virginia and Boston bolster colonial confidence and the ability to mount a defense. Small raids continued against the colony until 1717, mostly from the Lower Creek. Among the other tribes, there's going to be a rotating door of alliances. But the colony survived the worst, and after not too long, people even felt confident enough to leave Charlestown and return to what was left of their plantations. As for the Yamasee, they get a bad rap. The war was named after them, but only really because they were driven to fire the first shot. By August of 1715, the first year of the conflict, a quarter of their population had been killed or enslaved, and they were forced to flee South Carolina. Tracking them from there becomes difficult. It seems some may have joined the Lower Creek, but many others sought refuge with the Spanish in St. Augustine. In the subsequent decades, the colony and Yamasee kept in touch. South Carolina would occasionally attack settlements near St. Augustine, and the Yamasee would attack them back. South Carolina would be forced to make some changes. 6 to 7% of the settlers died in the war, over 400 people. They built additional forts for protection, and the Indian slave trade, a major reason for the start of the war, dies out. Don't worry though, they didn't learn that much. They start ramping up African slavery as their rice plantations become more profitable. You know the phrase, history repeats itself? You reap what you sow.